Today we're going to talk about kind of some in-season scouting things, and so we go throughout the summer here, these topics will change kind of pertinent to the area. So kind of just an agronomic update as to kind of what we're seeing, some things to be looking for across the entire Legend Seeds footprint, whether we're in South Dakota, North Dakota, over into Michigan. Some things we're already seeing, things that we could start to see. So specifically in corn, at the end, I can kind of give a little update of what we're seeing so far insect-wise in soybeans. It's been pretty minimal thus far, but those will kind of start firing up here once we start getting past that summer solstice at June 21st timeframe. That's when we kind of really start seeing insect pressure ramp up in beans. Okay, so kind of just painting the picture. This is kind of the last couple months that we've all been living, but this really kind of helps set the stage for what we're currently seeing out in fields and what we might see here in the future. So just, we had really variable conditions from north to south. It's kind of a joke, but like our agronomy group chat, Stephen Ressler liked to put in there, there's a meteorology page on Facebook that would put, blizzard conditions like in the middle of May. And it kind of seemed like in North Dakota, that's the way the spring was going to go through most of April. We had very cold conditions to the north. You get into the western part of Minnesota, parts of South Dakota, a few little isolated pockets in Wisconsin. There were guys rolling April 15th pretty heavy on stuff. So, and the planters didn't shut off, and there was parts of Minnesota that by May 1st planting was done, and parts of North Dakota and northern Wisconsin hadn't even turned a wheel yet. So there was a lot of variability of when the crop got put in. There still may be some areas of guys patching things in now, or, with wet holes, dry up here now. Some guys have gotten moisture, but very variable across the entire geography. So the one thing that stayed constant, though, is we were very cool at the start of planting for pretty much everybody. We had a day or two where we'd get up in the 75, 80 degree range, and then we drop back down into the 60s, and we go back up into the 80s and down to the 50s. So that was kind of true of the entire geography. But the one thing, though, that's been kind of a constant here in the last couple weeks is that we have started to rapidly accumulate GDUs. Now, over the weekend and today where I live, it's in the low to mid 70s or the high, forecasted highs. But for the 2 weeks previous, we were pretty much maxing out GDUs on corn or very close to it every single day. So we went from essentially being put in the refrigerator to being put in a blast furnace. So, the other thing is there's been a lot of cover crops out there, or call them crops that were planted before we went to corn, whether it be like, wheat that was half winter killed, or rye used as cover, or alfalfa that didn't make it, or, or sod fields, grass hay fields that we decided to kill off. Those cool conditions were not always conducive for completely terminating cover crops. So, the calendar date said it was time to spray. We were, in the mid 50s, and we weren't really planting corn yet because the nighttime lows, we had a lot of frost into May. So there was lots of, we'll go out and spray today. We won't plant. Well, that caused some issues we didn't really get alfalfa to die properly and on time, and rye kind of slipped through the cracks and spots. And some guys had really good kills, don't get me wrong, but that kind of leads to some issues, and the issues that I've seen out in the field so far, that's kind of traced back to those cool conditions as to blame. A lot of guys are like, well, my Roundup didn't work, or, I was struggling with this. Well, we just weren't warm enough to have that chemistry work on those plants. They weren't actively growing, so we didn't get the chemistry moved to the active site of action to have that kill. Same thing on the weed pressure side. I just talking to guys around the countryside and driving around, a lot of spraying been done in the last couple weeks here, and in the last 2 weeks, weed control's been very good. But a lot of the the pre-emerge type chemistries, we were cold there for a while, but a lot of our residuals did not have a lot of activity, because the one thing through that cold weather is we did not have a lot of moisture. And so we didn't get a lot of those residual type chemistries to work. Now some guys might have caught rain here or there and had them have decent control. But that allowed weed escapes, and the one thing that a lot of insects like is and I'll talk about it, is the diversity of green color in a field. And that's kind of led to some insect breakouts here and there. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then I already talked about the last bullet point there. Rainfall patterns vary really widely. We've had, some of the weather systems that did come up, we might not have received rain, but the wind currents and the wind directions is actually what allowed some of this insect pressure to get up this way to the upper Midwest. We might have been on one side of the front to the other, but the insects don't care if it rains or not. They care about with the way the wind currents. That's how a lot of them travel up to this geography. Okay, so this is just kind of so far some of the stuff that I've been seeing. So I cover kind of the eastern part of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, a little bit into Illinois is my geography. I will say, though, that as you go into the western part of Minnesota, South Dakota, and North Dakota, I know these are problem childs out there somewhere. So not widespread, but this is just stuff that I've seen. So early on, we saw a lot of wireworm pressure, a lot of white grub, cool soils, plants not growing very vigorously and getting out of the ground super fast. Those are more early season insects, if you will. Both live in the soil profile and really only affect corn seedlings. If your corn is rapidly growing, wireworm is generally not an issue. White grub can reach back and get you, though. If you've got corn that's at V4, V5, V6, white grub, they prune roots off. They can kind of be a problem. So that wireworm is the top left picture there. The white grub is the top right. A weird one that I've seen very pockety, and it's always been in conjunction with black cutworm, is a little bugger down there on the left called hot vine borer. That is not a popular corn insect, and a lot of times when you'll see them, it's if we have bad black cutworm pressure, they're also present in the field. I haven't seen any fields this year where we've had hot vine borer is the one insect that's out there. It's just kind of, they just show up. It's kind of like common rust in corn. If we see common rust, there's probably a different disease out there that's the bigger problem. But they are out there. But I'm going to focus on the three that have the stars there today. So black cutworm, armyworm, and corn rootworm are kind of the big three. So I don't have a picture of the corn rootworm on there right now, but the black cutworm would be that bottom right picture, and then the armyworm would be that top middle. Okay, so I'm going to start right off here. So black cutworm has been a pretty big problem, widespread in 2026. Now, when I say widespread problem, that doesn't mean that they're chewing every field in the upper Midwest and, it's a pandemic, anything like that. But of all the insect complaint calls that I'm getting, 90% of them, I would say, have been black cutworm. So typically where we're seeing that, corn no-tilled into sod, weedy no-till fields where no pre's, were applied, or the pre's just didn't activate, where we had a lot of weed pressure, cover crops. Those are the fields that are most at risk. So if you've got fields out there, customers, dealers, if there's fields out there that that have kind of that description, I'm not sounding the alarm and saying, oh my gosh, there's black cutworm everywhere, but not a bad idea to get out and check those fields and just take a look at kind of what's going on. And there's that diversity of green color that I talked about. So the one thing, and it's also true of armyworm, but black cutworm, the one thing that really drives them, and I'll talk about here in a minute, is the moths, when they fly in, they're looking for the diversity of wavelengths of green. So when they fly over a cornfield, if you're on a conventional tilled field and it is the only color is one solid hybrid planted out there, and there's zero weed pressure, zero cover crops, no waterways, not saying they won't land in that field, but very, very, very unlikely. If you go over a field and we've got a little bit of giant ragweed and some waterways, and then we've got some grass escapes on an edge, and then we've got a really bad pocket of water hemp on a hilltop, that is kind of the type of stuff that they like to lay in. Or where we've had rye taken off for forage and not terminated, or we're planting green into rye, and the big one that's been the biggest issue, and it has been for the last, I'm sure, 50 years, and it will continue to be an issue, is late killed or spring killed sod, whether that's alfalfa, 50-50 alfalfa grass mix, that, and especially this year, a lot of that stuff was sprayed early in the season and planted 2 weeks later, but it took so long for that alfalfa to die that we were still getting that wavelength reflected from the sun up into the atmosphere. And when those moths are flying in, they sense that, and then also that color change with the corn, and that's when they fly in and lay their eggs. So but the biggest thing here, we're almost out of the woods on cutworm for a lot of the geography. Not saying they won't do feeding, but if you're passing V6 corn, generally you're out of the woods. The corn plant gets too big for them to essentially kill the plant. They might do some feeding, but it's not economical feeding. Where they do their economical damage is when they cut the whole entire plant off. So if you're planted after May 15th on corn, those fields right now are extremely susceptible. So same thing, like I wouldn't draw a hard line in the sand saying if you planted May 14th that you're, completely safe. But those are the fields, that May 15th to 20th time frame on corn planted. That'd be, we're looking at V3, V4 corn right now, probably stage wise. That early planting, that April plant date, early May, we're pretty much out of the woods there. So the other thing with the at risk is anything without protection. So your straight roundups, conventionals, that are planted with anything previously green on that field this spring. And I say this kind of as an ask, please check those fields out. Most of the complaint calls I've had has been, and I've got a slide on here in a little bit, is, my corn was here when it came up. I looked at it right after I planted. Now it's just gone. The thing with cutworm is a very fast acting insect. When it comes in and it hits, it's not something you have 3 weeks to make a decision on if you're controlling or not. You a lot of times have a day or two at most to catch it. So I talked about this a little bit. Apologize to the bean picture there on the right. That should have been a corn slide. But so that's kind of what they look like. So they fly up on the winds, wind currents from the south. They lay egg masses in fields, so the larvae hatch, and then when they feed, they clip off corn plants. They'll also clip off alfalfa and other stuff, but they really have a sweet tooth, I guess, for corn. So the biggest thing to know if you have them, it's really almost impossible to find the egg masses, but the larvae are nocturnal. So like if you see clipped off plants, and there's a picture on the next slide of what that looks like, go to the nearest residue in the field, whether it's a little clump of a dying alfalfa plant or a corn stalk or anything like that next to a clipped plant, and flip it over. And typically you'll find them. They need moisture. They seek out moisture, especially with this year. Most of them were hiding in seed trenches or have been. And that's why the pressure has actually been really, really bad, as they get in that seed trench and they go to a corn plant and they chew, and then that trench is a lot of times where the only moisture has been. It's kind of a cool, dark place. They're nocturnal because if they were on the surface, you'd have turkeys and birds and everything else, pheasants, everything would be eating them. So they're nocturnal, so they only feed at night for the most part, or if they're below the soil line, they will feed during the day. But they kind of just follow that trench down, and they can clip quite a few plants in a short period of time. So here's what the classic picture looks like. So from that stage, if it's clipped like that, to not being able to really find or recognize that plant only takes about 48 hours. It's actually quite shocking how fast a little corn plant that's been clipped off dries up to the point where you can't see it. Now, in this instance, it's clipped above the soil level. Typically, you'll see them clipped above the soil level when we have very adequate moisture levels and the soil is called almost too wet, where they're living above the soil line, above the ground. This year, 99% of the feeding pressure I'm seeing is below the surface of the soil, and that's just because of that moisture. So, but I hear this all the time. I get complaint calls or texts from dealers. The corn was here last week and we showed up to spray it and it's all gone. There's only half a stand. Where did it all go? I knew it was here. Besides sandhill cranes, or deer, that's the only thing that'll do that. But typically, if you hear a customer say that, kind of the first thing I go to before, if you ever go out and look at it, is that's likely black cutworm. So the thing, like I said there, conventional tilled fields, less susceptible, but I have seen pressure in worked fields, especially with weed pressure, and or if we got lots of waterways, contour strips nearby, those kind of things, weedy fence lines, those sorts of things. So just thresholds real quick. So So the economic threshold, so if the larvae are less than 3/4 of an inch long, it only, to be at economic threshold, if you have greater than 3% of the population that field clipped, it pays to spray. The reason is if they're less than 3/4 inch long, they've got about a week and a half of their life cycle left to go. And usually there's not just one or two of them in your field. There's thousands upon thousands of them. And they can clip anywhere from 1 to 3 plants a day at that size, depending on how much. So they can do a lot of damage in a quick hurry. If the larvae are greater than 3/4 an inch when you go into the field, if they're over five, you have to have greater than 5%. Reason being is if they're over 3/4 an inch, they're about ready to hatch back into a moth and go through another life cycle. Now the moths don't just hatch and then lay eggs right back in your field again. They'll take off and fly and move north. Is kind of how they do that, because black cutworm does not overwinter for the most part in Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas. It overwinters much farther south. So, but that's what I'm saying. Like it's one of those things where it's a very timely scouting. If you're out there and you're seeing it, if it's stuff that gets custom sprayed for control, the phone call better be made when you're in the field. Don't sit on it and wait for a couple days there, like it says. If you're at 2% of the plants clipped when you go out there and scout it, don't just say, well, we'll come back next Saturday and I'm going on vacation. We'll come look at it next week. If they're less than 3/4 inch long, there won't be anything to look at. It will all be gone. So it's one of those things I really think that when entomologists started naming things, they should have called these things armyworms, because we'll talk about armyworm in a minute. But I feel that the threat on economic loss is a lot bigger with black cutworm than it is with armyworm. A lot of people are always afraid of armyworm as the big one. I would argue that there's more yield loss, especially in the upper Midwest, in corn, I should say, to black cutworm than there is armyworm. So, but that's the thing, is it from 2% to 3 to 5%, to be at threshold is less than a day. So like if you're out there at the right time and you catch it, and you think going down a row, 2% is, you find one plant in a 17-foot 5-inch row, that's at threshold to spray. So it does not take a lot. So corn traits that are susceptible, and this is the biggest thing I want to touch on. So obviously conventional corn has no protection. There's no insect traits. Roundup Ready and GT, just with the economics this year, a lot of guys went to conventional or straight single traits, especially in those cover crop fields. I don't really need traits this year. We'll just kind of just hope we got by. Unfortunately, it's probably the year to not do that. This is probably one of the higher black cutworm pressure years that I've seen. The biggest thing here is double pro. So VT2s, the bear trait above ground, does not have protection against black cutworm. So I run into a lot of guys that think they're buying that trait, and I've got full above ground protection. I am covered. I don't need anything else. VT2 does nothing for black cutworms. So that's, if you get a VT2 planted into sod or any of that kind of stuff, that would also be something to check. If you're planting anything with Power Core, Vipteras, any of the AA from Syngenta, any of the Duracade stuff, all of that stuff has protection. So if you have that trait out there, you can kind of sleep at night without worrying that you're going to have an issue. The other one that doesn't is 3010. There's not many. That's a Syngenta trait. It was the old GTCBLL. There's not many of them left on the market. But if you have any of that stuff, that does not have cutworm protection either. Okay, so kind of shifting gears here a little bit, we're going to go to fall armyworm. So this one is just starting up. So kind of call it the black cutworm. We're kind of getting towards the end of its being a problem. Fall armyworm is now starting to ramp up. So don't let the name fool you here with fall armyworm. It's pretty much a summertime pest for us in the upper Midwest here. Now it can show up really, really bad in hay fields late in the year typically. I've seen outbreaks on it, and silking corn, those kind of things. But typically our problem with armyworm is going to come from V6 to V10 is kind of, it seems, is when that gets, essentially when black cutworm stops, that's when armyworm starts. So I would say that every single year, no matter where I'm at in the legend geography, there is some area or some part of one state that has an absolute epidemic of armyworm. Black cutworm's a lot more spotty. Some years you see a lot of it, some years you don't see much. Armyworm, typically it's somewhere. It's just a matter of who gets the dart thrown at the dartboard and where it lands. The feeding pressure, just like black cutworm, gets out of hand really fast. This one, we're not necessarily losing plants. You're not losing entire plants just with a tiny little bit of feeding. It takes a while, but you're shot holing leaves. You got a bunch of rip tissue that's exposed now to let diseases, let moisture out, those kind of things. And I'll show some pictures of what it looks like when they get really, really bad. But so I would say that armyworm, if I was drawing up a kind of a perfect situation for their life cycle, if you've got any kind of corn going into a living grass crop, so whether you desiccated it or not, if you're taking rye for forage, if there's even like rye nearby, wheat, any of that kind of stuff, grassy or hay fields, old sod, CRP, any of that stuff, if you put corn into that when it was living and then you spray it, especially later in the season, like a lot of times those, call it like the alfalfa or those kind of grassy or hay fields, guys decide, June 1st, there wasn't a lot there, I'm going to tear it out and then I'm going to go to beans the next year and it'll make my rotation easier. And so we kind of make that split second decision to put corn in there, and then usually plant first, spray it off. When we spray it off, we essentially killed 99.9% of their food source. Is gone. The only thing left green in that field is now your corn crop. And that's, I highly, highly suggest when we're going into living green, if we're planting green and then desiccating the crop, I almost always will recommend a trait to control. Armyworm is the big one, but also black cutworm. But and typically now this year, I've had a few calls where armyworm is just kind of firing up. I actually drove by a field late yesterday that looked really good before I went on vacation this weekend, and there's armyworms in it now. So it doesn't, and you can see it from the roads. It doesn't take long to be able to identify it. So here's kind of what they look like. So the feeding, so the insect obviously itself's on the right. When you look at the left there, so that kind of gritty looking material, the little ball, so that's called frass. And essentially for layman's terms, that's the worm poop there. So that's the telltale sign. If you've got feeding on a plant and it looks like it's just been ripped to shreds and you're like, what do I have? 99.9% of the time it's going to be armyworm, especially the dead giveaway is that frass. So what they'll do is they get into so here's kind of their life cycle. So they'll lay eggs on the underside of the corn leaves. Typically anywhere from the moths will fly in, they'll lay 100 to 200 eggs depending on the size of the mass. The eggs will almost look like they have mold on them. It's kind of like a jelly-like substance that's on there that helps them stick. But so they hatch within a few days of being laid. So it's really hard. You really got to be looking at corn pretty much every day to every 2 days to catch the egg masses. That's a really hard thing to do. I have seen it before. If you have big flights coming up continually where they're just, like if we get in a wet pattern where we've got 80 to 85 degrees every day, we're getting rain every other day, and you start seeing armyworms, and it's going to be like that for 2 weeks. Sometimes you'll catch those egg masses out there. You'll actually see them as they just continue to fly up and fly up and fly up. Typically that's later in the season though. But so they hatch, turn into the caterpillar or the larva, what we all see, and then they feed for about 2 weeks. So after 2 weeks, the larva hatch back into the moth. The moth flies elsewhere, lays some more eggs, and the process goes. So each moth can lay about 1,500 to 2,000 eggs in its lifetime. And they're only living for 30 days. When you go way far south or like in the fall, their life cycle can be longer just because the weather conditions are cooler. But typically for like right now, this area, it's about 30 days is that entire life cycle. So people are always like, well, what does it look like? And I couldn't find one on my phone from last year, a picture. And so I found this one on Google Images. But I have seen, imagine if you took all of the vegetative tissue off a corn plant, if you peeled it all off and all you left was the midribs of every leaf. So it almost looked like a skeleton out there. I have seen 40-acre fields look like that, and it only takes about 6 or 7 days to get to that point. So when the feeding pressure and the larva pressure is heavy enough. But for threshold for spraying, so greater than 20% of the whorls. So if you go down a row, count 10 plants, if you've got 2 of them that have living larvae inside the whorl, so you can actually stand over the top of the corn, look down, and a lot of times you'll see the larva, or you'll see like all the chewed up leaves, kind of looks like almost like you took a weed whip to it real quick. You can kind of see in the picture there. If you start seeing that on 2 of 10 affected plants ballpark, or if you measure off 17 feet 5 inches ballpark, you start getting 6-7 plants, that's at threshold to spray, and that's in the vegetative stages. So that's armyworm can be more devastating when the corn is smaller because they eat a lot, obviously, but the corn can take a lot more feeding pressure early on in its life because most of those leaves are sloughed off by the time we get to tassel anyways. As that plant grows, it normally sheds leaves. So the later in the season it is, if they, obviously there's more tissue there, but it's actually more detrimental to yield because we're stuck. Those are the leaves we're stuck with all the way through harvest to help fill that grain out. So now the big thing is silking and later. So when we get through pollination and you start having armyworm, if 5% of the plants have feeding on them, it's economical to spray. The reason is armyworms can get into the ear and sometimes are confused with earworm. So they will go down into the husk, start damaging kernels at that very tip of that ear. Typically, they're not going to go zipper an entire ear, but if it's at the wrong time, they can actually start, I wouldn't say clipping silks, but they can start affecting pollination. And when you start doing that, then you can really lose economical yield. And that's typically something you're going to see down south. We normally to the north don't see armyworm pressure that late in the season. But I will say, if you got corn that was planted super late, that's, different than everything else in the neighborhood, those are kind of the fields where that stuff can start to pop up. So kind of sound like a broken record here. Corn traits that are at risk, conventional, obviously, Roundup and GT. Every other above ground trait for the most part is going to control armyworm. So your double pros are going to control Acre Max, Power Core. It's a very easily controlled pest through traits. But for the spraying side, if you've got conventional or Roundup, obviously there's no defense there, and that's typically where you're going to start seeing that stuff show up. Okay, so I talked about 2 that are kind of call them the problem children for right now. The kind of the ones to keep an eye on that are currently out there. The next one I'm going to talk about in parts of our geography are definitely starting to be out there. But corn rootworm. And so I'm going to kind of keep this talk somewhat vague. It really depends on your geography of if you have feeding yet or not, depending on, where you're at or where you're located on a map. But this is the big one to keep an eye on. And I'll kind of explain why in a minute here. But the scouting for rootworm really starts about now, to know kind of where you're sitting. And from now for the next 30 days, all the way out till we get, obviously through tassel. And then once we get through tassel, then it becomes and really when I'm talking scouting, I'm talking the larva, not the beetles. We're too early for beetles yet. We're just starting to get to the point where we're having larva hatch from the eggs. So this last year, so 2025, pressures were not as high as they have been in previous years. Now they're still around, don't get me wrong, but we're seeing way more problems, I would say, on rotated acres across the geography than we are on corn and corn. Doesn't mean they're not in corn on corn. It's just that we're not managing for the extended diapause that we're seeing in a lot of cases on the rotated acres. So when it shows up, we have zero protection, zero warning. And so that's where we see the most economic loss. So it takes approximately 680 to 770 GDUs for the eggs to hatch. Now, the weird thing with rootworm is, so we think GDUs, as farmers and out there and as agronomists, we think GDUs, we think, okay, that's from plant date. Well, rootworm don't care when you planted your corn. They care about when they're getting heat units for hatching. So now this spring has kind of been a unique one, as I said, that we haven't really had, a lot of warm weather till recently in the last couple of weeks. But the thing is, we've been accumulating GDUs since April. We've been above in the 50s, 60s, kind of flirting around there pretty much every day. So we've slowly been accumulating GDUs. And then the last couple of weeks, we've really been, essentially floored the soil with those GDUs and allowed the rootworms to hatch. So Ellsworth, Wisconsin's where I live. So last night I went on quick on a calculator online. So from 4/1 at my place, I'm at 808 GDUs already. Now, granted, that's not plant date. Nobody planted in Pierce County April 1st, but essentially you got to look at it. That's when the biological clock started on those rootworms. So now why that matters is guys that planted corn on corn later in the season here. So like if I had somebody around where I live that planted corn on corn May 20th, May 25th, if we're using insect traits, we think we're covered. Those traits, and it doesn't matter if we're talking Smart Stack Pro, VT4, Vorseed, Chrome, any of the Duracates from Syngenta, Durastack, none of those traits are expressed until about V5 or V6, when the plant actually starts making the protein that controls those insects, or the rootworm. It's not being expressed. That gene doesn't turn on. So what can happen is we can have corn that is protected theoretically, that's getting fed on by rootworm larvae, and we don't even realize it. It's a 1 in 10 kind of year scenario. I haven't seen this yet this year, so I'm not trying to sound the alarm, but just so you guys kind of know that this could be out there in certain isolated spots. But this is the 1 in 10 years where we have that situation where we start accumulating GDUs. Some people might have been delayed on planting because of cool. There were some pockets that were wet, especially eastern Wisconsin was fairly wet for a good margin there. Those areas might be those scenarios where we start seeing rootworm feeding. Now, when the traits are expressed, they'll start to work and they'll do their thing, kill the larva, but we may see a little bit of early feeding that could stunt plants back a little bit. If we see some corn on corn fields out there that you're like, they were planted late and you're like, man, they're not growing. They're not really progressing. They kind of look like they need some help. Those are the fields to kind of start taking a look at and seeing what we've got going on out there. So kind of everybody's like, well, what if I don't have a GDU calculator? Kind of what's called the old wives' tale. And I texted Steve Ressler the other night, this probably a week and a half ago, and I was like, man, that's early. The firefly hatch. So no matter where you live, if we're in South Dakota or if we're in out in Michigan, I don't know if the fireflies blew away in South Dakota this spring with all the wind you guys had out there, but when the fireflies hatch, that's typically ballpark around the same time that we got rootworm larvae hatching. So a week and a half ago, I was probably, from my example there, I was probably at about 650, 700 GDUs. That should have been about right for when rootworm hatched. So, which is very, very early for our typical area. So that's kind of one thing just to keep on the radar, especially there's parts of Minnesota, if you were planted now April 15th, your corn, and as I'm driving across the state today, there's a lot of corn that's at V6 and about to fly past that very quick. So our traits are probably going to work, but those later planted acres are the ones that are kind of the ones to keep an eye on. So how to scout for corn rootworm larvae. So kind of there's the top picture there that's showing just a bunch of different sizes of them, and they do hatch in different stages or different hatches, if you will. So the first one is about 50% of the hatch that you're going to get, and then there'll be different hatches throughout the year, as later and later, and they'll hatch all the way through. I mean, you can have hatches all the way out through very easily, kind of just call like a bell curve, right? You get a lot of them right away, and then it tapers off fairly quick. There's always some that hatch later, just to spread, the rootworm's risk out of survival. So easiest way to look for them, though, is dig row. So if you go out to a field, and this will really start ramping up for the scouting of it here in the next 3-ish weeks, all the way out, kind of call it like that July 4th to July 10th timeframe is kind of a big one when you really start seeing it. So you go out there, pop the root balls out with a shovel. Don't pound a lot of dirt off on them. Don't do any of that. Just keep as much of it intact as you can. Fill a couple 5-gallon buckets with water, stick them in there, and kind of just pull them up and down, shake them around a little bit in that water, and then just kind of let them sit. And over time, those rootworm larvae, if they're in that profile or in that soil, will float up to the surface. They'll you can actually, put your finger in there and look at them. They'll actually stick right to your finger and pull them out. And that gives you kind of a good indication of what you're dealing with for larval counts. Now, you might only see, one in one bucket, and you go over to another plant, you might see 50. So you got to pull obviously more than just one. If you want to see what kind of damage they're doing or kind of what your level of control is at that point, what you do is kind of that bottom picture there, if you see, is I don't recommend a pressure washer. If you guys have ever seen me preparing for plot days, I can look a little dirty doing this, but if you take a hose and just wash the water off that root ball and really get, just so you only have that root system, you can really get an idea of what you're looking at for feeding. So and it's a lot easier to wash the roots off once they've been sitting in a bucket of water for 5-10 minutes, rather than just pull them out and just start washing the, semi-dry dirt. That's very, very hard to do. So there's a thing called the nodal injury scale. And so what that is, essentially you're looking at the top 3 nodes of a corn plant. So set 5, set 4, and set 3 on the roots. Essentially when you have an entire node that's completely fed off, where all the roots are completely fed off, it would get a score of 1. A score of 3 is really, 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 really bad pressure. So like, just as an example, and it might be a little hard to see, but so that root system that's on the right in that picture and that slide is a fairly good root system. There's a little clipping here and there, but if you look at the root system on the left, we really don't have much left. That would be classified as about a 3. I'm just ballparking it looking at the picture, but to kind of give you an idea, and with corn rootworm, no matter what trait's being used, no matter if we have insecticide on or not, if you're corn on corn and you have rootworm pressure, you will see feeding of some degree. The one thing rootworm will do that's kind of, they'll clip roots, prune them completely off. The other thing is you'll see a lot of tunneling damage, and tunneling damage is they'll kind of bore into the root, and they won't completely feed it through, and those kind of get all those brown discolored marks all over the root system. A lot of tunneling is typically deeper. A lot of the clipped roots is generally going to be shallower, because a bulk majority of those rootworm larvae are going to be found in that top part of that profile. As you move deeper, there are some that lay eggs deeper in the profile, and those rootworm larvae don't travel very far in the soil. They're not swimming up 10, 12 inches up and down in that profile there. So the feeding that's down low is very minimal, which typically ends up as tunneling and not clipped roots. So I kind of talked about this a little bit already, but where to keep an eye out, or where is the first place we should head when we're starting to scout? The obvious answer, corn on corn acres, right? The more long-term corn on corn it's been, the more likelihood we're going to have, moderate to severe pressure. There is a lot of corn rootworm pressure that showed up in rotated fields, especially in that western half of Minnesota, or even southern Minnesota, I'd call it, all the way moving across into South Dakota. I've seen it a little bit in Wisconsin. It's more pockmarked, a little bit into Illinois as you get down that way, but it's that extended diapause is really heavy when you get essentially kind of call west of Mankato, moving across Minnesota into South Dakota, eastern South Dakota, and then in parts of Nebraska, those kind of things. So, it doesn't have to be just, it picks this field and not this field to lay eggs. So kind of those rotated acres were to kind of keep in the back of your head or think back of, what went on there last year. If you have a field next to it, or, just across the road, or somewhere that's very long-term continuous corn on corn, it doesn't matter if your bean field was completely spotless the year before. The pressure and the from those rootworm is likely they're laying eggs in your field when you have corn, and then they winter over, and then you have them the next year. So doesn't necessarily have to be an issue that is caused by you, but it can be from neighboring fields a lot of times. The biggest thing I can see, the number one, if we have extended diapause, is when they start asking questions of, what did last year in this field look like? Typically, there was uncontrolled volunteer corn in the soybeans the previous year, and where the areas of the field where the extended diapause pressure is the worst is typically where the worst volunteer corn was. That volunteer corn is behind typically in maturity from regular field corn across the fence. So when the pollen is all gone, that's rootworms, one of their main food sources is corn pollen. When that's all gone and that volunteer corn decides it's going to tassel, it's typically weeks after field corn is, a typical crop field. those rootworm larvae will move into that volunteer corn. They can smell that through pheromones, and they will go to that as the kind of their next favorite food source. And then when they're living in that, that's where they're going to lay their eggs. And sometimes we think, oh, it's extended diapause I have. Well, sometimes it can just be that, no, maybe we don't have extended diapause, but we didn't do a good job of controlling that volunteer corn. So now we have rootworm in that field. You can have extended diapause. There's two species of rootworm that we typically deal with. We have the westerns and the northerns. So westerns are the ones that have the black lines down their back and they're yellow. Northerns are going to be kind of more of a green color. Northerns are typically the ones that everybody thinks about with extended diapause. There is getting to be more and more populations of westerns that are starting to show extended diapause. It's not as widespread as the northerns, but that's something to keep on the radar. And if anybody wants to dive into that, feel free to call me or ask questions after the call here. But so that's the biggest thing if in the extended diapause or the I shouldn't say extended diapause, in rotated acres, the biggest thing, if you don't want to have to deal with rootworm, sometimes we can't control everything, but the one thing you can control is volunteer corn in soybeans the year before. That's usually the number one cause of rotated acre issues with rootworms. And with that, that's all I have. Kind of short and sweet today. I wanted to just keep it to the main corn insects we're seeing. We'll likely have another one of these on soybeans once the time comes we get a few more insect pests out there in soybeans.
Thank you, Jake, per usual, for always heading up these tech talks and doing a great job. So everyone have a good day. Thank you again. And this ends the call.